Go full screen there. All right. Well, thanks to all of you for joining me. I really appreciate it. I wish we were all in person, but the world conspires against us. So good afternoon. I think it's still afternoon. I've had that debate with some of my guests on my Twitch stream. Is it afternoon? Is it evening? And what is that crossover? But we'll just say good afternoon for the time being. Now, if you've been in our industry long enough, you know that there are a lot of patterns in software development because we're usually solving problems that others have already encountered, and maybe they've solved it better or worse. But a lot of times we still insist on reinventing the wheel, which is interesting. But certain patterns do emerge, and experienced designers reuse solutions that have worked in the past, or to quote Pablo Picasso, good artists copy, great artists steal. Now, the patterns movement, as we understand today, was really started by Christopher Alexander. And he's an actual architect, not like me. I mean, I'm a software architect. I always try to make sure people know I'm in software, not in building. In fact, usually the way I describe myself is architect as a service, which is pretty fitting. Although I will admit the first person to call me that, I sounded the acronym out in my head and realized they may not have intended that as a compliment to me. But, the Chris Alexander is the person who came up with this idea of a patterns language, and it's influenced so many things in our industry, from language design to programming to the wiki to agile development. And so he's really the sort of the father of what we'd consider the pattern language. And as software engineers, we're probably at least passingly familiar with GOF, with the Gang of Four book, the design patterns book. I remember when this came out, this was a pretty eye-opening thing for me. And what you realize very quickly in software is design is all about these trade-offs. And we have to make so many decisions on projects, and some seem inconsequential, and then they are, and until they aren't a few years later. And so a pattern just describes these problems in a core solution and then allows us to reuse them again and again and again. Think about your home. There's certain patterns that repeat in a house. We all have doors. You need a way to get from one room to another. I mean, implementation details of doors vary widely, but you need to be able to get in and out of a room. And if you've watched TV or a movie or read a book, you probably have found yourself saying, this sounds very familiar. Am I having a big case of deja vu? Is it a glitch in the matrix? And of course, there's 7 or 9 basic plots. There's the hero's quest and the rags to riches and overcoming the monster. And well, it turns out we have a lot of this as well. I've put a lot of front ends on relational databases over my career. And I like to joke that every application eventually boils down to spreadsheets and email, because that's what our customers are familiar with. And so Goff basically just documented these. And I'm sure you're familiar with many, singleton, proxy, facade, etc. I was on one project where, jokingly, I think someone said, well, we got 11 of these patterns into the first release, and we're hoping to get the rest into the next version. But this isn't the only example of patterns, right? We have Martin's work or I should say, this series on enterprise application architecture. I helped write a book about presentation patterns. And so it turns out these are really, really powerful because they give us a real easy opportunity to reuse. And now I can leverage this proven solution. And it also saves me a lot of time because I have much coarser grained blocks to build from. I'm not starting at zero. This allows me to focus on what's new in my world. And I've got this really good handle that I can use to describe this to other people. It's a very convenient shortcut, if you will. A friend of mine refers to this as a higher bandwidth conversation, because I can say something like facade, and I've now conveyed a tremendous amount of information to you, assuming, of course, you're familiar with facade. Now, we're all at least aware, I think, of these patterns in software. But what I want to get to today is about the patterns and how we think and how we react to some of these situations. And you can think of these really as cognitive biases, if you will. Now, I'm very much a fan of the fact that awareness helps us avoid these issues, or at least deal with them more constructively when we inevitably encounter them. When I was a young engineer, I really genuinely thought technology, software, it was just all about the tech. And the longer I'm in this industry, the more painfully, in some ways, aware I am that it's really a people game, and it's about working with other people. Every software project is a people project. We have egos, we have emotions, we have to deal with that. And I know a lot of us get into this line of work because we don't really want to deal with kind of the messy human stuff. It's unavoidable. It comes with the paycheck. So I'm going to walk you through some of the things that I've either experienced firsthand or been around projects that have these kinds of issues. Hopefully, this will at least give you some tools to deal with it when you see it in your world. One of the most, I guess, frequent thing I've run into is the not invented here problem, otherwise known as NIH, or not my idea. This is shockingly common in software. I'm amazed at how often people have this attitude that, of course, I can build something better than this off the shelf solution. And sometimes that is actually correct, that what we're doing is unique. But in other cases, it's just painfully obvious that this is not a good idea. I was at one organization and we didn't realize this until they tried to go to production, but a group had, for lack of a better word, essentially created their own sort of cloud platform like thing. And they'd even created their own application framework. And it was kind of mind boggling what they had done. They'd also stood up a Git instance on a server. They just, well, I think it's actually just a computer under somebody's desk. I mean, it was just mind boggling. Like, why would you do all these things? And so I've seen this a lot where people rightly, usually wrongly, have this concept that what we do is so unique. We are a special snowflake. This is our secret sauce. Now, again, in some cases, that's actually true. If our pricing algorithm is really what differentiates us in the marketplace, and that's how we make our money, yeah, you probably should own that pricing algorithm. It's probably not something that you should offload to a third party or something that you should get off the shelf. But our focus really does need to be on differentiators. Now, I have seen some cases where it's our business partners who are really driving us towards this bespoke solution because they really feel like what they do is unique and they don't want an off-the-shelf piece of software. They want something that is hand-rolled, that because it gives them that sense of, yeah, we're really special. And perhaps they have spread that gospel far and wide inside the organization. In order to keep that up, they need to have this special software. I love building software, so I'm happy to do that. But there's a lot of instances where we really should just get a solution here. A lot of companies, a lot of teams have this strong bias against any ideas that come from outside. Sometimes this is politics. Sometimes this is a turf war. Sometimes this is just pure jealousy. All of that comes into play. It's also an instance of what my friend Neil Ford refers to as meta work is more interesting than work. So yeah, I could put a new field on that page, or what would be really fun is writing a framework. That would be cool. That's the kind of work, because I'm a senior engineer and I need to do hard things. And so I will build this amazing framework. Why should I use Spring when I could create my own version? That's way more interesting and it's a lot more fun for me. This is often a sign of insecurity in the developer and the people who are trying to push this. Now, I'll give you an example from my past. I was at a company, this is quite a long time ago now, and I introduced this dynamic language into the organization. In fact, we had a problem, a specific issue in our build that would have been solved very elegantly by using this particular language. It wasn't going to ship with the product. It wasn't something we were going to have to support. It was literally going to allow us to do something in our build that we couldn't do otherwise. And when I proposed this to the person who was in charge of the build, his response was, "We don't resort to wacky workarounds here." I thought, that's interesting. I might argue that your entire build is a wacky workaround, but that's neither here nor there. Now, this same individual, about 6 months later, discovered the language that I had proposed 6 months earlier. And all of a sudden, wow, this is amazing. This is the most coolest thing ever, and used it all over the place. I think this was an instance where this person just couldn't stand the idea that someone other than him had introduced an idea into his domain, into his fiefdom, and he didn't want to share the credit in any way, shape, or form. Sometimes you have that personality that just does not want to admit that anyone other than themselves has good ideas. There's almost this pathological need to own the spotlight. It's important to understand that software, these projects, we're not playing a zero-sum game here, and we can and should share the credit with everybody. I mean, this is something we learn very early, or we're supposed to learn very early on in our academic career. Now, very closely related to this is the Ikea effect. This is another well-known cognitive bias that boils down to, we place a higher value on something we've created. So there was a study that was done that said people would pay 63% more for an end table if they had assembled it themselves. They ascribed a higher value to it if they were the ones that built it. So think about that with software. So I wrote this, ergo we can't get rid of this because this is really, really important. I wrote this. That happens an awful lot in software. I've gotten into those debates with developers when we've tried to refactor or we've tried to rework a solution, and they get very defensive about how dare you touch my part of the code base. There's also the mere exposure effect. And while familiarity may breed contempt, we tend to prefer things we are familiar with. Now, this, I think, leads to part of the dogmatism that many of us have around programming languages. I am very much of the opinion that for most developers, time began with whatever the first language they learned was. I remember on a mailing list when Java was looking to introduce lambdas, somebody actually piped in and said, I don't understand why Java needs these newfangled lambdas. Okay, well, lambdas have been around since kind of the beginning of programming languages, so I don't think this is a new idea by any stretch of the imagination. But a lot of developers seem to think that, well, all these ideas came from whatever language I first saw them in, and they must not have existed anywhere else. I think about this in terms of a conversation I had with one of my friends a couple of weeks ago. I've written a lot of Java in my career. I'm very familiar with Java, JavaScript, things of that nature. And I was working with a friend on some .NET, and she was showing me some stuff and asking me some questions. And I tongue-in-cheek said to her, why do you have such weird capitalization on all these methods? And I know that .NET and in C# in this case has different capitalization rules. And this was literally me just having a little joke with her, right? Because she knows my background, I know her background, and we both agree this is kind of funny. But, I can kind of read it. It's not like the code is in a completely different alphabet or anything. And what you have to understand is this stuff is basically arbitrary in almost all cases. Whether you camel case or not, really, it's not that important. And I remember being on one project, I was working with this individual and we were in a pair on something. And he spent like 45 minutes. This was before we had all our neat little formatters and everything else, and our tools were a lot less powerful back then. And he just went through this entire code base and reformatted it because he couldn't bear having, the brackets be on the same lines. He was very, very anal retentive about his brackets. And I just thought, is that the best use of our time, or should we maybe be focused on, solving the problem here? The most dangerous phrase I hear when I work with clients is, that's how we've always done it. This is so dangerous to me. I was working with one customer a few years ago. They had a performance problem. Basically, what this boiled down to is when they first began as an organization, they would take this customer's widgets and they'd process them, and they did it all sequentially, and it ran overnight, an overnight batch job. And then they got successful. And they got more customers, and the customers had more widgets. And all of a sudden, when I was working with them, the batch job wasn't finishing overnight anymore. And so after they walked me through their architecture, I said, well, hang on a sec. Does the processing of widget A have anything to do with the processing of widget B? And the architect said, no, not at all. I said, well, could you have like a pool of workers that just sort of grabs the next widget and processes it, and then maybe, dumps that result out to a queue to do some aggregation at the end? He's like, oh, yeah, I guess we could do that. Now, I don't think that I had some amazing insight that none of them were capable of seeing. It's just that I didn't have the baggage of that's how we've always done it. Now, why is this an issue? One of the things that I am fond of reminding people is the status quo isn't free. So just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean this is the optimal way to do it, doesn't mean this is even, the cheapest way to do it. I remember back in the day, I wanted to get a copy of IntelliJ, and my manager at the time said, why would I buy you that tool when Eclipse is free? Now, he was overlooking the fact that the company had a team of developers maintaining their Eclipse instances. So there were multiple developers billing out at far more than a copy of IntelliJ was going to cost, even if you bought one for every single person in the company. You could probably have bought everyone in the company 4 or 5 copies of IntelliJ, and it would still be cheaper than having a team of people support your free IDE. So we should ask ourselves, hey, how much is this current approach costing us? And it isn't just the cost of developing that solution. It's the opportunity cost of What could we be doing with those resources? What could those people be working on instead? How else could we deploy that particular amount of budget? You think about the time and the people that support this hand-rolled framework. Well, that's time and money that you can't spend on other people's problems. And we have to ask ourselves, like, where do our customers want us spending our effort? Where do they want us focusing our time and attention? And it's important for us to be working above the value line, or as I like to refer to it, less undifferentiated heavy lifting. This is one of my all-time favorite slides. That's my old boss, Andrew Clay Schaefer. Good job configuring servers this year, said no CEO ever. Now, it's important work. It needs to be done. We can't have servers running old unpatched versions of operating systems that have, critical vulnerabilities in them. But that's not the kind of thing that moves the needles with our customers. They want features, they want functionality. And we have to remember that to our customers, spring is a season. It's not a framework. And it's luckily enough the season we happen to be in, which is delightful to me because that means golf and outdoor bike riding and things like that are in my near future. It also means we may overlook simpler solutions. And who knows, we might be able to save days, weeks, or months with an off-the-shelf product as opposed to us having to build it and maintain it ourselves. Even if it only takes us a little bit of time to build, if this is something that we now have to maintain essentially forever, that again is not free. We also have to think long and hard about, are we going to be able to hire for this? If I put out a job post today for people who know Spring, there's a lot of developers that are familiar with Spring. But if I put out a post for my internally developed framework, by definition, I'm not going to find anybody outside our company that knows that. So I need to keep that in mind. A lot of times we excuse this via the sunk cost fallacy, which boils down to, I'm going to use my past spending to justify even more spending because, geez, I've already spent so much money on this. It would be a waste of all that money if we stopped now. It'd be like throwing that away. The analogy would be, well, I overate for lunch. I had a pizza and I had all this food. I might as well have an entire cake after dinner. Well, that's not the way that works. The past is the past. There's nothing I can do to go back and change that. It's gone. That money has been spent. Nothing I can do today changes the past. So we should be basing that decision on what's in front of us right now. Should we continue down this path? Does that make sense? Or is it time to change direction? What's the right choice for us today? In other words, if you find yourself in a hole, put the shovel down. Don't keep digging. That should be pretty obvious. It's time to move on. It's also important that we be willing and able to ask why. Why are we doing this? We tend to get very myopic. We tend to get very set in our ways. We fall into our habits. This is what I have to do. I was at one organization. I was looking at some code and I asked my peer, I said, hey, Jeff, why are we closing this tag on the following line? And he said, oh, well, it turns out that a few years back, there was a version of Tomcat that had a problem. And if you closed the tag on the same line that you opened the tag, you couldn't change the language encoding later. I said, oh, okay. Well, is that still a problem in Tomcat? Oh, no. They fixed that quite a while back. Like, okay. Do we support that old version of Tomcat? No, not at all. All right. So why am I seeing this closing tag on the following lines? Like, oh, that's probably just an old piece of code. I said, well, yeah, I thought that too, except I looked and it was committed this morning. He went, oh, yeah, that's not good. That's how we've always done it. Never, ever diminish the power of a fresh perspective. I love getting a new person on the team. She's going to see something that the rest of us has missed. You get that person right out of school, they don't have any preconceived notions of how this works. They will literally see things we don't. If you understand how our eyes work, if you understand how people with different sort of color issues work, some people can see the number here, some people can't. Never be afraid to challenge the status quo. Never be afraid to ask, what is the status quo costing us? It's not free. Don't dismiss new ideas out of hand. Why won't that work? I love having junior developers around because they will find things that we will miss. I'll tell you an example from my history. Early on in my career, I was given this really, really simple task. Go capitalize billing addresses. All right, cool. And my tech lead gave me, I go to this routine and use this function. And I'm looking at this capitalization function and I cannot get my head wrapped around it. In my mind, it should take like one argument, the string to capitalize, except it didn't. It took like 15 arguments, and I was really confused. I'm like, this does not make any sense to me. And so after trying to figure it out, I kind of time boxed it. I thought to myself, wait a minute, I think this is going to take me a lot longer to figure out. And boy, capitalization seems like the kind of thing that's probably baked into the language. So I searched, I looked around. Sure enough, there was a built-in function in the language to do capitalization, and I used that, and I solved the problem within a couple hours, and away we go. Well, the following week, we're at our team meeting, going around the room, what have you been working on? And so my tech lead's like, hey, Nate, tell us about the capitalization assignment. Did you use that routine that so-and-so wrote? I said, yeah, no, I didn't. I just used this built-in language function. And like every head in the room turned and looked at me. It was like literally like a record scratch. I'm like, whoa, okay, did I do something wrong here? And the reality was, even though I was the least experienced developer in that room, I was the only one who knew that was a feature of the language. Everyone else is like, well, we have this routine. We just use this routine. Now, I have no idea when that was added, but this was yet another example of, well, that's how we've always done it. I didn't even think to look for another way. Now, there's two lessons that I took out of this. First and foremost, if you think there should be an easier way, there probably is. So take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, take an hour to do a little bit of research. Is there a simpler way to do this? The other piece of this that I think is so important is never underestimate the value of fresh eyes. I'm seeing that on my team right now, because I've been on my team for about a little over 4 years, I think. And for most of that tenure, the team has pretty much stayed the same. And then we've had a little bit of turnover here in the last year or so. And so we've gotten some new people on the team. And one of the new people made this interesting comment about, do we all have an onboarding guide? And it's like, oh, yeah, no, we don't have one of those. And so he's writing one. And it's like, yeah, that would have been a really good idea, but we never really thought about it because we hadn't needed it before, because we weren't getting a lot of new people on the team. Now that takes me to solutioning, otherwise known as the XY problem, or I like to call it the jump to conclusion mat. In software, we have a tendency to immediately go to solutioning, often before we have any idea what the real problem is. And I adore this quote from Rich Hickey. Most of the big problems we have in software are problems of misconception. We don't have any idea what we're doing, and then it's just go, 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 go. I have seen this countless times. Well, we got a development team, so they need to start slinging some code. Yeah, but we don't know what the requirements are. It doesn't matter. Just have them start writing some code. Right, but we literally don't know what we should be writing. It doesn't matter. Just have them write code. Well, we're going to throw that away. Yeah, it's fine. It blows my mind that companies would prefer to have developers literally writing throwaway code than, I don't know, doing basic research, doing some education, doing almost anything else. To me, is a better use of their time and a better use of our resources. This is just endemic in software. It shows us that we will miss really important details. A friend of mine was telling me he was on a project where they ran into a client versus customer issue. And so as they began this project, they assumed that client and customer were the same. The way their product owner talked about them, they seemed to just be synonyms of one another. And so they developed for several iterations with the idea that client and customer are interchangeable. And then they were in a meeting, and their PO said, well, that'll work for a client, but not a customer. Cue record scratch. Well, it turns out with a little bit of digging that client and customer are similar, but very distinct concepts. Now, no amount of testing, no amount of type systems is ever going to find an error of misconception. It is far better to avoid the problem in the first place than try to work around it later. Now, we also have this tendency to sometimes focus on the wrong details, or we make a lot of assumptions. So if you have an engineer come to you and say, hey, how do I get the last 3 characters of a file name? Your first reaction should be, why do you need to do that? Well, file extensions are always 3 characters, and I need to get the file extension, so I just want the last 3 characters. Okay, but there are that's like a legacy constraint, and there are many files now that don't have a 3-character file extension. So what do you really want? You want the file extension. That's a different problem. As with NIH, ask why. Focus your effort and energy on solving problems, and don't be afraid to slow down. Again, we are always in such a rush. Like, we got to get this into production in seconds. I am very fond of this phrase: take the time it takes so it takes less time. Think about when you're rushing and you're all concerned and you're just kind of throwing things together, you always forget something. Take a deep breath, double check. Do I have everything I need? Cool. Now, one of the comments that I hear a lot from my spouse, who's right over my shoulder, it's really fun doing these presentations from home: stop solutioning me. Now, she's a business analyst. She likes to joke that her job is to tell people like me what to do. And of course, my response is, honey, I'm an architect. I take whatever you give me and build what's most convenient for me. But it's important for us to take a step back and ask, what are your requirements? What are you really trying to do here? So take some time to reflect. Is there a simpler approach? And we also need to be very, very aware of yak shaving. This is so common in software, happens all the time. All right, I need to solve this problem. And to solve this problem, I need to use this library. But to get this library, I need to update my package manager. Well, shoot, in order to update my package manager, I need this new version of Python. But to get this new version of Python, I need to update my operating system. The next thing I know, I'm shaving a yak and I'm covered in yak hair, and the yak's not very happy. And I'm not sure why I'm shaving a yak. So I should probably just put down the clippers. This actually literally happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I was trying to share a presentation with a colleague. And so I went to the collaborate button and it said, well, you need a new version of Keynote. And so I went to the App Store and there was no new version of Keynote. And so I tried that a few times and that didn't work. And then I realized, oh, I bet I finally need to upgrade my operating system. And I upgraded my operating system. And I've literally spent the last 2 weeks running into new things of, oh, and now I need to upgrade this. And oh, now I need to update that. And oh, wait, this isn't working the way it used to. And okay, now I need to fix this. So take a step back and ask yourself, what was the problem again? And don't be afraid to break out of this loop. Don't be afraid to explain it to a coworker. This is another thing that literally happened to me last week. I was working on this little interactive code example, and I could not get this thing to work. And I'm staring at it. I'm like, but this should work. This should work. It's just like this other one. And so I sent the code to a friend of mine. And I said, Jonathan, what's going on here? And Jonathan said, hop on a Zoom. I'll help you solve this. And literally 45 seconds into the Zoom call, as I'm explaining to Jonathan, I look at it and I go, oh, well, that needs to be equal instead of not equal. And I felt like such an idiot. But it's amazing how often just describing it to another person is going to expose that assumption, or it's going to unlock. That's what it did to me. It went, oh, wait, but I'm doing a different check here. Keep a rubber duck on your desk. Explain it to the duck. If that's not, cool enough for you, I have a little astromech right over here to my left that I do this to. It's one of those droids that I built when I was at Disney some number of years ago. And so that's the thing I explain it to. It works. It really does. Now, if you don't have room on your desk for that, that's fine. You can doodle, you can daydream, go for a walk, do some stretches, grab a cup of coffee. I'm a huge fan of coffee. It also helps you live longer. Check your assumptions. Now, still got nothing? Don't be afraid to sleep on it. And this is where we get into this notion of R mode versus L mode thinking. And some people refer to this as right brain, left brain. It's not quite that simple. It's forest versus trees. So the R mode processing is our search and retrieve. It's the nonverbal part of how our brain works. It's not directly controllable. It runs in the background and it gives us unpredictable results. So you'll often find the answer to that question comes minutes, hours, days later. If you've ever been watching a movie or a TV show and you're like, I can't place that actor. Who is that actor? And then 20 minutes later, oh yeah, it's so-and-so. That's the R mode at work. So if you want to unleash the R mode, you need to distract the L mode. So you prime the pump, you think about the problem, and then you do something that's kind of rote. So hop in the shower, mow the lawn, wash the dishes. That frees up the R mode because the L mode's just so excited to do this rote thing again and again and again. So that forces you or allows you to take a step back and say, what is the problem? What is the use case? Is there a simpler way? In software, we need to be ruthlessly pragmatic. We cannot afford dogmatism. We should not have a formulaic approach. This is a lesson I learned from a dear friend of mine who passed away a couple of years ago, did a lot of agile consulting. And he was helping this team out. And his first reaction to their ginormous C code base was, oh my gosh, you guys don't have any tests. This is a problem. We should write some tests. But because he's done this long enough, he said, all right, hang on, let me challenge my assumptions a bit here. And as he sort of looks around, he says, well, wait, I'm sorry. How long has everyone been on this project? The person with the least amount of time on the project had been there around 10 years. So basically everybody was 10 plus years of experience. And my friend realized, wait a minute, that's actually not what this team needs. And so he did what any good coach does, and he adapted to the current situation instead of relying on a formulaic, well, this is what I do everywhere kind of approach. Another thing that's incredibly common for us is imposter syndrome. I didn't realize how endemic this was until this last couple semesters. I teach a grad class at the University of Minnesota in software engineering, architecture, and things like that. And I've had multiple students. These are all full-time working adults. These are all people who are successful in the industry. These are all people who are getting an advanced degree, and they've had imposter syndrome. And so I've had to talk to several of my students about this. And what I've come to realize is we all suffer from this. All of us, every single one of us at some point or another has this experience. You know, this tweet really kind of spoke to me. I had such a terrible day. Even though I've been doing this for a decade, I thought maybe I'm not cut out for this. You know, even somebody who's been doing this a long time successfully. And you know what? It's healthy. We saw this actually. I was in a conference. We were on a panel, and we'd kind of heard these rumblings in the audience. And so what we decided to do is we all introduced ourselves and said, "Hi, my name is Nate, and I write crappy code." And "Hi, my name is Neil, and I write crappy code." And every single one of us basically admitted we've written bad code, because we all have at some point or another. There's a pretty good chance that during your career you've read through some code and you're like, "Oh God, what idiot wrote this?" And then you take a step back and you go, "Oh wait, I'm the idiot that wrote this. I'm a little smarter than I was 2, 3, 4 years ago." That's actually a good thing. That's actually healthy. Quite frankly, you should be a little disappointed in something that you wrote several years ago. It means you've learned. And that's a good thing. That's a feature, not a bug. It's actually scary if you look back at code that you wrote a while ago and went, "Oh, that's great. Can't imagine how I'd make it better." Be very, very cautious of the person who claims to know everything. Believe me, they don't. And that's a very dangerous place to start from. Software today is becoming very, very specialized. It's a lot like doctor was at the turn of the last, well, I guess 2 centuries now back. Used to be doctor was a very broad term. You went to the same person to amputate a leg, to pull a tooth, and they'd probably give you a shave too. I guess that we referred to that as like a full stack doctor. That's not the case today. Orthopedic surgeons focus on certain joints. The surgeon that I worked with, he just does hips and knees. He doesn't do anything basically above the waist. There's other doctors who all they do is shoulders. All they do is this particular style of arm surgery that works for people who play baseball or something. There are doctors who, ironically enough, specialize in being a general practitioner. The software body of knowledge has exploded over my career. There used to be this adage, Alan Case, of people who are really serious about software should make their own hardware. Now, let's be fair. When was the last time you built up a computer? I mean, maybe you've played around the Raspberry Pi, but, and that's fine. It's not a bad hobby. I mean, I built a computer, I guess once, twice, maybe 3 times, but look at the cloud today. Let's be honest. The vast majority of us are short-term leasing someone else's compute. Now, the challenge for us is the reality that you can't possibly know it all. I'm sorry. Heat death of the universe is going to happen before you can. Every day there is probably more material produced, more podcasts come out, more movies, more video gets uploaded to YouTube than you could possibly consume in the rest of your lifetime. And that's sad on one hand, but you know what? It's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think a lot of us have this sort of fear of missing out. Believe me, if something is a big enough news story, it's going to bubble up into your consciousness. I love this Kelsey tweet. Focus means you won't get to surf every wave in the ocean. He's absolutely right. You're going to have to let some go by, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with saying, "I don't know." This is actually a really comforting thing for junior devs to hear from senior devs. "Well, I'm not sure why that worked either," or "I'm not sure what's happening here." Sherrod had this great tweet from earlier this spring. Folks, it's okay to admit you don't know something. It's not okay to shame someone about that. "I'm surprised you didn't know that." Don't ever do that. You know less than you know. Love that. It's also important to understand that a lot of what we do is just kind of weird. I assume this isn't actually true. I'm sure someone photoshopped this, but it still makes me laugh. Software programming is unexplained phenomena, essentially. And I do love this tweet as well. The best engineers I know admit when they don't know something. Now, that's hard for us. It takes a certain amount of humility. It takes some confidence. But let's be honest, you cannot possibly be an expert on all of it. There is nothing wrong with specializing. And I think that is somewhat at odds with the way we throw around the word full stack developer. You'd have to know an awful lot. You'd have to know multiple front end technologies, a bunch of different databases, a bunch of languages, all three cloud providers. Oh, and don't forget CI/CD, DevOps, SRE, security testing, architecture, design. Where's that person live? That's a unicorn. Doesn't exist. What we really mean, I think, is much simpler than that. It's someone who is willing to work on whatever we need to do today. In other words, a specialized generalist, or some people call this T-shaped. Basically, we need to know a little bit about a lot of things. And as an architect, it's really important that I know a little bit about a lot of things as opposed to being an expert on one thing. So you need to know there are multiple different frameworks. There's multiple different databases, multiple different kinds of databases. There's different cloud providers. It's perfectly natural and healthy to have gone deep on something, to know a lot about Java, know a lot about Azure, etc. But there are going to be things you don't know, and there's going to be things that you know, and that's okay. It's important to understand how we acquire skills as part of this. And one of the best ways to phrase it is Shu Ha Ri. It's actually something Martin has written about. The most pithy way I can describe it is this Bruce Lee quote, which says, learn the principle, abide by the principle, and dissolve the principle. Or another way of phrasing it, imitate, assimilate, innovate. Our understanding evolves. And William Schultz had a great way of phrasing this. He said, at first things seem really simple, then they get really complex. And then you find sort of that wonderful, profound journey that comes at the end of it. It looks really easy. And then you get a little deeper and you're like, ooh, actually, this is really hard. And then the quest continues and you see just the depth of how much there is for you to know in this particular space. There are known knowns. There's things you know, and there's things you don't know. The challenge for so many of us is there's this vast ocean of unknown unknowns. The Dreyfus model would say we have 5 stages. At first, we're a novice. We need recipes. Do this, do this, do this. Advanced beginners, you start to move beyond the rules. Well, what if I mix a little more whole wheat into this recipe? Competent, you can troubleshoot. Okay, this didn't quite proof the way I thought. I must need to have a little longer or needs a little more heat. Proficient, you can self-correct. And then expert, it's just intuition. If you ask a world-class golfer, how do you hit a fade? They just think, well, I just think cut and the ball cuts. I can't teach that to a beginner. That doesn't do any good to a beginner. They need a rule. They need, all right, open your stance, open the face, swing along your body line, the ball start left and gently fade off to the right. Well, friends, that is the end of my time here today. Are there any questions that I can help answer?